I'm going to give you the idiot's guide to the exposure triangle. I'm going to show you a demonstration as well, and I'm also going to explain what the effect has on your final image. So each of the three things, aperture, ISO and shutter speed, all have an effect of what your image will look like, as well as exposing your image correctly. Basically, it's just the amount of light that hits your camera's sensor. So too much light, overexposed, too little light, underexposed. That's basically all it is. All we're trying to do is control how much light hits our sensor to get that image nice and exposed. So the first thing we're going to talk about is aperture. First of all, what is aperture? Aperture is basically like the pupils in your eye. So you walk into a dark room, your pupils open up and it lets more light in. You walk out into the sunlight, they close down, they let less light in. That's basically what aperture is, and that's basically what happens inside of your camera lens. When you open and close your aperture, you have little blades and it will close down or open up and let in the actual amount of light that goes into your lens. What effect does aperture have on your final image? Simply put, it controls the depth of field. So it's how much of your image is in focus when you take your photo. So f1, for example, you would have a tiny amount of your image in focus, a shallow depth of field. f22, for example, would give you pretty much all of your image in focus, so a higher depth of field. So that is basically what happens, and I'm going to show you a demonstration quickly. Now, this lens only goes up to f4, I think, so I'll have to show you on f4, but I'll show you what the f4 looks like and then what the f22 looks like. I'm going to take a picture of this bark, so I want to try and get as much of this in focus as I can. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to zoom right in, and I'm going to include some of the background as well, so you'll see how the depth of field changes. So that's the first image at f4. And that's the second image at f22. Let's talk shutter speed. So shutter speed is how fast or how slow your eye opens or your shutter opens on your camera and lets light in. So the quicker it opens and shuts, the less light hits the sensor. The longer it opens and shuts, the more light hits the sensor. So if you're in a dark room, for example, you want more light to hit that sensor to expose the image correctly, you'll leave the shutter open for longer. If you're in a bright sunny day, you want to open and close that shutter quicker, leaving less light to hit the sensor. The negative or the effect, depending on which way you're looking at it, on shutter speed is if it's open and closing faster, you are freezing action. If it's opening and closing slower, you are blurring action. So anything moving in your frame when you open the shutter and close it for a longer period will blur across the screen. Anything moving in your frame when you open and close it on a high shutter speed, say 1/2000th of a second, will freeze, so it will look like it's staying still. That's the effect on shutter, and I'm going to show you that now. So let's just show you what I mean by the shutter speed. So now let's say, for example, I want an image of the cars driving past and I want the cars blurred in the image. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lower my shutter speed so the cars driving through will expose for longer in the image, and then what that's going to do is going to create a blur. Now the way I would do that on this, I would change my shutter speed so I'm at about, I'd say, an eighth of a second. Then I'm going to bring my aperture higher because I want to expose my image correctly. Now I've got an ISO set at 100, so now I'm correctly exposed at an eighth of a second, and as I take this image, it will blur. You can see there the cars are blurring through the scene. Now, if I wanted to get the cars frozen, I would do the opposite. So I'd bring my aperture all the way down, my shutter speed all the way up. So let's say, 500th of a second. No, let's go 1000th of a second. And then I'm going to bring my ISO up to 400 to give me a correct exposure. I'm going to focus out on the road, and then as something drives past, I'm just going to put high continuous shooting on and then just shoot a load of images as they come through. So we'll wait for something to come on the opposite road. So it comes through here like this. you go. And then I can take those images and you'll see that each one is nice and frozen in the frame. Finally, ISO. ISO is the only one of the three that doesn't control the amount of light coming into your camera. So with shutter speed, you're opening and closing and letting in the desired amount of light. Aperture, you are closing down and opening up the aperture to let in the desired amount of light, whereas ISO only controls the amount of light that your camera is sensitive to. So the same amount of light is hitting the sensor, but your camera is more sensitive to it, therefore brightening the image. And I'll show you an example of that, of how a lower ISO and a higher ISO can affect the noise in your image. So using my exposure triangle, I've increased my shutter to 8,000th of a second, f8, and it's giving me an ISO of around 32,000 between, well, it's jumping between 25 and 32,000. So I'm going to take that image and I'm going to show you, I'm going to focus right there, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. That is the noise that you'll get from the high ISO. Obviously a lower ISO, less noise, and I'll show you that quickly as well. So f4, shutter speed of 1/25 of a second, and there is that image with a lot less noise. Now you know what the exposure triangle does and how it affects your images. You can go out and have a play and see what you can come up with. So if you wanted a slow shutter speed, for example, of a car moving past to get the blurring of the car, maybe 1/10 of a second, set your shutter speed to that, and then use your aperture to control the amount of light. So if it's too dark, for example, you can use your aperture, lower it to a lower f-stop, and then you can get that image correctly exposed. Now there are a couple of things to add to this. Obviously, if you're lowering your shutter speed, you might want to stabilize your camera on a tripod so you don't have motion blur in the image when you take the photo. The other thing is, if you're not too sure on your exposure triangle and you still want to get creative, you can use the two creative modes, which are aperture priority and shutter priority, and both of those will expose the image for you but leave you the control of whichever one it is. So shutter priority, you would set your shutter speed and the camera would expose the rest of the image for you using the other parts of the triangle. The only downside to that obviously is it may bump your ISO up too high, that you may not want that to introduce that noise, but that will give you a more creative way than just all auto. So give that a go, and then let me know in the comments as well how you get on using your exposure triangle. That is the exposure triangle in a nutshell. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments whether this made sense or whether this was helpful to you. It's always good to know, and it helps me with making future videos. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.